Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. We are beginning chapter 18, which is entitled Lobster on Food Stamps. But before we do that, please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, whether you're listening to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Anchor, YouTube, Facebook, wherever you've got a hold of this, please share it. If you inbox it to somebody, share it on your Facebook page, Twitter page, Instagram story, Snapchat story, wherever you can share that, please share this. I want to also encourage people to follow the May 30th Alliance on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, wherever you can follow an organization or an individual. Please go and follow us on those places. And if you have not listened to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily, I encourage you to please listen to those. If you have not, and if it's future episodes out by the time you do listen to this, please listen to those. And we are we're gonna dive into it. We're on page 215 of Evicted. The line around the welfare building spanned the length of Leach Street and wrapped around the corner. Barricades had been erected and extra police officers summoned. The governor had announced that food vouchers would be given to households affected by storms that have flooded parts of the state, including Milwaukee County, and by 7 a.m., thousands of people had lined up, jostling for position and even trying to get inside by taking a door off its hinges. The Marshall P. Coggs Human Services Center was massive. 3 stories of cream brick, it had 170,000 square feet and 232 large windows. The building had originally held a Schuster's department store, but the store, along with the surrounding neighborhood and city, had fallen on hard times around mid-century. It was finally shuttered in 1961 and the building sold to the county. When the building was renovated in the early 2000s, it consolidated 450 county employees under one roof. A California-based artist was commissioned to install bright, multicolored ceramic tiles above the windows that display words like, quote, contemplation, end quote, and, quote, dance, end quote. She called her installation, quote, community key, end quote. A little past 8 a.m., Lorraine walked past the crowd and made her way inside, hardly looking up to notice the strolling security guards or escalators transporting people between floors to fill out forms and meet with caseworkers. She took a number, 4023, and waited. Lorraine was there to get her food stamps reinstated. Soon, not a seat was empty, and room 102 filled with the sounds of children and chatter. An older woman leaned on her umbrella and tried to sleep. A mother spanked a toddler. Another was engrossed in women who loved too much. After 1 hour and 40 minutes, Lorraine's number was called. Not bad, she thought, having spent entire days in the welfare building. Quote, I had an appointment on the 20th of this month, end quote, Lorraine explained to the multitasking and manicured woman behind the glass. Quote, but between the time of my scheduled phone call, I had gotten evicted, end quote. Quote, you have to reschedule your appointment, end quote, the woman replied. It was another missed meeting and another canceled benefit, both the result of an eviction that threw everything off course. The woman handed Lorraine some papers. Quote, here's a list of things you need to bring with you, end quote. Quote, I don't have anything with me, end quote, Lorraine replied, reading the list. Most of the necessary paperwork was in storage. Quote, well, if you don't have anything, then you can't bring anything, end quote, the woman smiled. Lorraine looked confused. Quote, but will I still get my benefits? End quote. Quote, that's why you have to come in for the appointment. I can give you a food pantry referral. Would you like to go to the food pantry? End quote. Lorraine took an escalator downstairs to the food pantry, walking out with 2 grocery bags filled with canned beef and kidney beans and other things she hated. Sometimes, family members who didn't know any better would ask Lorraine why she didn't just call to schedule her appointments. Lorraine would laugh and ask, quote, oh, you want to try the number? End quote. She had never once gotten anything but a busy signal. At her follow-up appointments, Lorraine managed to get her $80 a month food stamp allowance reinstated even without all the necessary paperwork. Leaving the welfare building, she shuffled past throngs of bored, tired people and street alcoholics congregating outside and into a nearby furniture store with bars over windows. Inside, experimental jazz was playing over an organized clutter of plump recliners, dark wood dining room sets, and brass lamps. A salesman with a Middle Eastern accent approached Lorraine, who asked to see the armories. She inspected a 7-piece bedroom set. She gawked at a 62-inch television. Quote, I have TV smaller than this, end quote, the salesman said. Quote, no, but I want this one, end quote. Lorraine smiled. Quote, why don't you do it layaway then? End quote. Quote, you have layaway? I love layaway, end quote. Lorraine was participating in a kind of cleansing ritual, swapping the welfare building's miasma of unwashed bodies and dirt with the smell of a new leather sofa. She was also entertaining a fantasy of making a good home for herself and her daughters. Jamie was finally out of prison and staying with Lorraine and Beaker until she found an apartment. And maybe Megan would come around. She used to put the girls' clothes, new clothes, on layaway. To Lorraine, putting something on layaway was saving. Quote, I can't leave money in the bank, end quote, she said. Quote, when you're on SSI, you can only have so much money in the bank, and it's got to be less than $1,000. Because if it's more, they cut your payment until that money is spent, end quote. Lorraine was talking about SSI's, quote, resource limit, end quote. She was allowed to have up to $2,000 in the bank, not $1,000, like she thought. But anything more than that could result in her losing benefits. Lorraine saw this rule as a clear disincentive to save. Quote, if I can't keep my money in the bank, then I might as well buy something worthwhile. Because I know once I pay on it, it's mine, and no one can take it from me, just like my jewelry, end quote. Well, no one except Eagle Moving. Before her eviction, Beaker had asked Lorraine why she didn't just sell her jewelry and pay Tobin. Quote, of course, I'm not going to do that, end quote, she said. Quote, I worked way too hard for me to sell my jewelry. I'm not going to sell my life savings because I'm homeless or I got evicted, end quote. It wasn't like she had just stumbled into a pit and would soon climb out. Lorraine imagined she would be poor and rent strapped forever. And if that was to be her life, she might as well have a little jewelry to show for it. She wanted a new television, not some worn and boxy thing inherited from Lane and Susan. She wanted a bed no one else had slept in. She loved perfume and could tell you what a woman was wearing after passing her on the sidewalk. Quote, even people like myself, we deserve, too, something brand new, end quote, Lorraine said. Lorraine didn't put anything on layaway that day. But when her food stamps kicked in, she went to the grocery store and bought 2 lobster tails, shrimp, king crab legs, salad, and lemon meringue pie. Bringing it all back to Beaker's trailer, she added Cajun seasoning to the crab legs and cooked the lobster tails in lemon butter at 350 degrees. She ate everything alone, in a single sitting, washing it down with Pepsi. The meal consumed her entire monthly allocation of food stamps. It was her and Glenn's anniversary, and she wanted to do something special. Quote, I know our relationship may not have been good, but it was our relationship, end quote, she said. Quote, some things I will not ever get over, end quote. But the lobster helped. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's take a moment for reflection. I think one of the most interesting things to come out of that passage is the section about the limit or the SSI's, quote, resource limit, end quote, allowing Lorraine or any individual on SSI to have up to $2,000 in the bank. But anything more than that, they would stop sending the money essentially until that money that was in the bank got spent. And I think that is a direct disincentive for these people to save. And it also stops them from being able to accumulate this money and keeps them in the I would just imagine makes it more likely that they will be making decisions that perpetuate them being in the cycle uh, of poverty that they're currently in. With them continually having to purchase things, whatever you purchase, it depreciates in value the moment that you purchase it. And so It's not as if, even though Lorraine is saying she's bought this jewelry, she bought these TVs, these things are hers now, these things still have depreciated with value once she's purchased them. And they're not as valuable as having some of that money saved in the bank. And so I think that's the main thing that stands out to me. Let's continue reading. When Lorraine spent money or when Lorraine spent money or food stamps on non-essentials, it baffled and frustrated people around her, including her niece, Sammy, Susan and Lane's daughter. Quote, my Aunt Lorraine is one of those people who will see some $200 beauty cream that removes her wrinkles and will go and buy it instead of paying the rent, end quote, said Sammy, a hairstylist with her own shop in Cudahy. Quote, I don't know why she just doesn't stick to a budget, end quote. Pastor Darrell felt the same way, saying that Lorraine was careless with her money because she operated under a, quote, poverty mentality, end quote. To Sammy, Pastor Darrell and others, Lorraine was poor because she threw away money. But the reverse was more true. Lorraine threw away money because she was poor. Before she was evicted, Lorraine had $164 left over after paying the rent. She could have put some of that away, shunning cable and Walmart. If Lorraine somehow managed to save $50 a month, nearly one-third of her after-rent income, by the end of the year, she would have $600 to show for it, enough to cover a single month's rent. And that would have come at considerable sacrifice, since she would sometimes have had to forego things like hot water and clothes. Lorraine could have at least saved what she spent on cable. But to an older woman who lived in a trailer park isolated from the rest of the city, who had no car, who didn't know how to use the internet, who only sometimes had a phone, who no longer worked, and who sometimes was seized with fibromyalgia attacks and cluster migraines, cable was a valuable friend. People like Lorraine lived with so many compounded limitations that it was difficult to imagine the amount of good behavior or self-control that would allow them to lift themselves out of poverty. The distance between grinding poverty and even stable poverty could be so vast that those at the bottom had little hope of climbing out, even if they pinched every penny. So they chose not to. Instead, they tried to survive in color, to season the suffering with pleasure. They would get a little high, or have a drink, or do a bit of gambling, or acquire a television. They might buy lobster on food stamps. If Lorraine spent her money unwisely, it was not because her benefits left her with so much, but because they left her with so little. She paid the price for her lobster dinner. She had to eat pantry food the rest of the month. Some days, she simply went hungry. It was worth it. Quote, I'm satisfied with what I had, end quote, she said. Quote, and I'm willing to eat noodles for the rest of the month because of it, end quote. Lorraine learned a long time ago not to apologize for her existence. Quote, people will begrudge you for anything, end quote, she said. She didn't care that the checkout clerk looked at her funny. She got the same looks when she bought the $14 tart balsamic vinegar, or ribs, or on sale steak, or chicken. Lorraine loved to cook. Quote, I have a right to live, and I have a right to live like I want to live, end quote, she said. Quote, people don't realize that even poor people get tired of the same old taste. Like, I literally hate hot dogs, but I was brought up on them. So you think, when I get older, I will have steak. So now I'm older, and I do, end quote. The next month was August, and Lorraine used some of her food stamps to buy instant mashed potatoes, ham, and cream corn for a hard luck family that had moved into the trailer next to Beaker's. The family of 6 had recently lost many of their things in an eviction and were sleeping on the floor. Once dinner was ready, Lorraine led a prayer. Quote, Dear God in heaven, thank you so much for this food, and thanks for all the people in my life who have blessed me. Thank you for Jamie, and thank you for my brother Beaker. Even though he makes me too angry sometimes, I still love him. Lord, please take care of my brother. Amen. End quote. 2 days later, someone knocked on the door. It was a tall white man with a mustache and a tucked-in collar shirt. He was holding a bright yellow piece of paper. Quote, Good morning. We are going to have to shut your gas off this morning. End quote, he said. Lorraine took the paper. Quote, Oh, okay, end quote, she said sheepishly. Quote, there's payment information on the back there. Have a nice day, end quote. The man went behind the trailer with his toolbox. Quote, so Uncle Beaker hasn't been paying the gas, end quote, Jamie asked, working her mascara brush. Quote, I guess not, end quote, Lorraine said, looking down at the yellow paper reporting a debt of $2,748.60. Quote, when do you finally grow up and start paying your bills? Uncle Beaker needs to grow up and stop living like a child. You too, Mom. You have a real problem with living above your means. You need to really just not do that, end quote. Lorraine looked at her daughter. Quote, I don't know when you got so cute, end quote, she said. As fall bled into winter, warmth began seeping out of the trailer. The thin walls and countertops and water and silverware in the drawer grew cold. Lorraine and Beaker burrowed under blankets, doubled up on sweaters, and plugged in two small space heaters. They both slept more to keep warm. If Lorraine fell asleep on the couch, Beaker would put an extra blanket over her. Early morning was the worst. Beaker would put on his heavy coat, but Lorraine's winter clothes were sitting in Eagle Moving's bonded storage facility. They were not the only tenants in the trailer park who couldn't afford to reinstate their gas before the first snow fell. As for Tobin, he hated the snow. He traveled to warmer climates during the winter. That brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. And yeah, let's have a reflection. And I think what stands out there is just the drastic different situations that the tenants in the trailer park are in, as opposed to the man who owns the trailer park. And that just gives you a small glimpse into the disproportionate nature of capitalism when it comes to how far the resource or where the resources are spread to. Let's continue reading. One fall day, Beaker told Lorraine he was moving to a federally subsidized assisted living facility for the elderly and disabled. The following morning, he did. This caught Lorraine by surprise. They had never really learned to talk to each other. After Beaker left, Lorraine knew she had to come out of hiding and make new arrangements, if not with Tobin, then at least with the new management company. She worked up the courage and walked down to the office in sweatpants and a stained black fleece. Quote, I need to get emergency assistance as soon as possible. Excuse me, sorry about that. Quote, I need to get emergency assistance as soon as possible, end quote, Lorraine told the college kid who had replaced Lenny. Quote, I'm so cold. The heat. All I know is I need the heat on, end quote. Quote, oh my goodness, end quote, the college kid said without looking up. He was nonplussed. He was learning. The college kid dialed the number to Beak Management and put Lorraine on the phone with Geraldine, the office manager. Geraldine told Lorraine that Beaker owed almost $1,000 in back rent. The gas bill was not the only one he hadn't paid. Lorraine sat in the office chair, resting her forehead on her palm. Quote, please, Geraldine, I need your help. I need your understanding, end quote. After a few more minutes, Lorraine hung up the phone. Her best hope of staying, she believed, was to convince Beaker to pay his back rent. Beaker's new place was in the Woods Apartments on College Avenue and 35th Street, across the street from Mud Lake. It was white-wall clean and new-smelling and warm. Lorraine asked Beaker to settle his debt with Beak. He said he could not pay 2 rents. Lorraine said she couldn't pay last month's rent because her money had already gone to storage. At this point, Lorraine had paid Eagle Moving $1,000. Reuben had room to store Lorraine's things, and Lane had a truck, but both said no when Lorraine asked them for help. Quote, well, I hope you go live with your stores because that's all, end quote. Beaker stopped himself. Lorraine looked pitiful. She had heavy bags under her eyes and her hair was a mess. It had been days since she last showered. She refused to ask Lane and Susan to use theirs. Beaker knew his trailer might just as well have been an abandoned shed. The heat, hot water, phone, and cable had all been cut off. A helpless, dull silencing hum between both brother and sister. Then Beaker said, quote, take one of those sweaters, end quote. Lorraine had 6 days to be out of Beaker's trailer. Beaker had written Beak Management a letter that read, quote, I'm moving and will be leaving my trailer to Beak Management for the money I owe them. I'll be out, and so will my sister, end quote. Lorraine learned about Beaker's betrayal. That's what it felt like anyway. When one of Beak's property managers got her on the office phone 3 days after she had visited her brother in the Woods apartments. The manager told Lorraine to be out by the first of the month. She had pleaded, quote, please, I have no place to go, end quote, and, quote, I'm not this bad person, end quote. But in the end, she just said, quote, I see. Thank you for your time and God bless you, end quote. Lorraine sat down, quote, I don't know what to do or where to go anymore, end quote, she said, quote, I have no idea, end quote. Lorraine began looking for a new place to live in the streets surrounding her church. It was the centerpiece of her life. It might as well be the centerpiece of her housing search, too. She shuffled gingerly along the icy sidewalks, calling landlords. Then she decided to stop by the housing projects in South Milwaukee, where she grew up. The woman in the office told Lorraine they were full and not accepting applications, but she gave Lorraine the address to HUD's offices. The Milwaukee branch of the Department of Housing and Urban Development was located downtown on the top floor of the Blue, a grand modern tower with a mirrored facade intersped with rows of candy blue glass. Lorraine's wet shoes squeaked on the lobby's terrazzo floors. The HUD receptionist handed Lorraine the multifamily housing inventory report, 13 legal-sized pages listing all federally assisted rental housing in the metropolitan area. Quote, I have no idea where half of these places are, end quote, Lorraine muttered at the long list of addresses and phone numbers. It hardly mattered, since most of the properties were reserved for the physically disabled or elderly. In fact, for years, Lorraine had assumed that most public housing was exclusively for senior citizens. Quote, and even they, a lot of them, couldn't get low-income housing, end quote, she remembered. Quote, so I thought, if they can't, neither can I, end quote. It was why Lorraine had never before thought to apply for public housing. Politicians had learned that their constituents hated the idea of senior housing a lot less than public housing for poor families. Grandma and Grandpa made for a much more sympathetic case, and elderly housing provided adult children with an alternative to nursing homes. When public housing construction for low-income households ceased, it continued for the aged, and high-rises originally built for families were converted for elderly use. Lorraine found 2 addresses on HUD's housing inventory that accepted applications for people who were neither elderly nor handicapped and that were located on the far south side of the city. Lorraine did not consider the near south side to be an option, let alone the north side. The application asked if she had ever been evicted. Lorraine circled yes and wrote, quote, I had some complications with the landlord and he evicted me, end quote. On the day Lorraine had to be out of Beaker's trailer, ice spread over the city. An early December snow had fallen, melted, and when the temperature dropped, froze. Lorraine stood in her kitchen listening to the sawing sounds of people scraping their car windows and chipping the ice from their doors. There was a pile of trash on the floor, mainly Beaker's empty Maverick cigarette boxes and chocolate milk bottles, and dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen sink. The cold had immobilized Lorraine under blankets on the couch, the cold and the question of what to do next. Little had been cleaned since winter had arrived. Quote, I don't care anymore, end quote, she said, swallowing pain relievers and antidepressants. Lorraine had applied to or called on 40 apartments. She had had no luck on the private market, and her applications to public housing were still being processed. Lorraine didn't know where she was going to go. She was considering approaching Thomas, a man her age who lived alone in the trailer park, or Miss Betty, whom Lorraine knew only as, quote, old lady who lives across the road, end quote. Lorraine packed up her remaining things. Her plan was to pay public storage $50 to keep them. Late in the day, Lorraine knocked on Miss Betty's door. She was a small white woman with crystal eyes and silvering blonde hair falling past her shoulders in double braids. Miss Betty looked younger when seated and enjoying a slow cigarette, but she walked like an old woman, hunched with one arm held close. What the women knew of each other came from passing hellos and rumors, but when Lorraine asked Betty if she could stay with her, Betty said yes. Quote, Sure, you can stay with me until after the winter, end quote. Miss Betty raised an eyebrow. Quote, I know you're not as big of a problem as they say you are, end quote. Lorraine smiled. Quote, I'll be able to take a shower and everything, end quote, she said. Betty's trailer might have been the most cluttered in the whole park. There was room for Lorraine, but little else. Miss Betty had piled her tables with magazines and old mail and canned food and bottles of soy sauce and candy. In the living room, a tree bent toward the window, shedding its leaves on the floor, and keepsakes were clustered together on shelves next to a picture of Jesus. There was an order to the mess. The bathroom drawers bore a resemblance to the nuts and bolts aisle at the hardware store, with all the travel-sized tubes of toothpaste and bobby pins and hair ties and nail clippers grouped together in their own respective compartments. In the kitchen, Betty had hung a sign. Self-control is defined as refraining from choking the shit out of someone who is desperately deserving of it. Lorraine agreed to pay Betty $100 a month. A few days after moving in with Miss Betty, Lorraine heard back on her applications to public housing in the form of 2 rejection letters. Each letter listed a pair of reasons Lorraine's application were turned away. Quote, collections from the state of Wisconsin, end quote, and, quote, eviction history, end quote. Lorraine understood, quote, eviction history, end quote, but not, quote, collections from the state of Wisconsin, end quote. When she called to find out more, she was told she owed property taxes. Quote, property, end quote. She laughed after getting off the phone. Quote, I love to know how I owe property taxes, end quote. Betty thought Lorraine should appeal. She looked over the top of her large glasses and said, quote, you have to fight, Lorraine. I had to fight for my Medicaid, end quote. Quote, I don't have the energy, end quote, Lorraine answered. Quote, and I don't feel like getting rejected again, end quote. Betty nodded. She understood. A few days later found Lorraine in an especially religious mood, her church's truth class fresh in her mind. Quote, when you look at Jesus, what do you see? End quote, Lorraine asked Betty. Quote, a hottie, end quote, Betty replied without missing a beat. A long, unlit cigarette shot out of her lips like a plank from a ship. Quote, oh, Betty, end quote, Lorraine giggled. Betty sauntered over and tapped the Jesus picture. Quote, hottie, end quote, she repeated. Quote, I've always liked men with facial hair, end quote. Quote, naughty Betty, end quote, Lorraine cooed. The new friends talked and laughed into the night. On the couch, they fell asleep at the same time. And that brings us to the end of chapter 18 and the beginning of chapter 19, which is entitled Little. So let's have a small reflection before we end this episode. So again, we see the lack of adequate options and resources for people once they have been evicted or once they are being evicted, once they have basically going through the last steps of the process of losing their home. There is not a lot of avenues open for them. And we see the difficulties in getting free public housing. We see some of the difficulties that exist in trying to find private housing as well. And in the experience, I think that the main thing that this book really hits home is just the experiences that these people go through in these situations. So we're going to end this episode. We will be back tomorrow to begin reading chapter 19 as we continue Evicted, Profit and Poverty in the American City by Matthew Desmond. And I'll holler at you tomorrow.